little bit about mid-season maintenance, and a little bit different here than Santa Fe. Albuquerque season starts a little earlier, and you may be further along than we are, so I hope I'm not getting everything wrong as far as your season, but we shall see, and you can correct me. So when you're talking about summer management, really you're relying on decisions that you made in the spring, and so in a sense you're preparing your whole season in that spring area. We had another situation this year where we had a big spring buildup, lots of fruit trees blooming, and then we had a hard freeze. And so that, and I'm not sure if Albuquerque had that, seems like there's a lot of fruit, but at any rate, this happens often in a lot of locations. And so during that time then in May often, we have to get in there and feed so that the bees don't totally pull back the brood. Kind of an unfortunate situation because it started out quite good. We had a lot of a nice bloom early on. And so always in the spring, if you're subject to those conditions, and some of you in the East Mountains might have those conditions, then once the bees start that spring buildup, if you don't want them to start pulling back on brood production and throwing drones out and sacrificing brood, then make sure that you're providing some food during that time. And then, if it is a good year and the bees are heading towards swarming, whether you decide that you're going to make some splits at that time to kind of suppress that swarm urge, that's possibly going to affect later on in the year, because sometimes you're trying to decide, well, do I really want to get more bees by making these splits, or can I manage this colony with giving them room so that they produce more honey for me and they stay a larger size rather than splitting them. So some of those decisions sometimes are made for you because the bees get on the road to swarming and you've got to split them. So if they have swarmed, or if you have made splits, or if the bees have superseded their queen, which they often will do under good conditions, then it's important to make sure that queen that a queen has emerged, and this is a photo of a queen that has emerged, and that she'll cut out that little cap and emerge from that one. This one, the lower one, also you can see the queen. A sister probably was killed by the one who actually emerged. Often you can see their shoot out on the sides after the fact. You want to make sure you don't have laying workers. If they have failed to raise a new queen, if they have swarmed and the old queen left, and you often then end up with a situation where they're raising queens, then if that queen fails to mate, we see that often in the springtime when you have adverse mating conditions. We had a lot of western tanagers this year that came through. It's a migratory bird, but they really pick off bees. They eat a lot of bees, and occasionally you'll have trouble with either the queens who are trying to mate, are picked off by birds, or they don't mate sufficiently with enough drones, and you can end up with laying workers where you have all these multiple eggs in cells, and this is not a good situation, and it dooms the hive. So you need to look out for that. If you do have a queen, you want to make sure that you've got a good pattern, a good laying pattern, with not too many holes in it, that's usually, this is sort of a real classic comb configuration here, where you have your, on a brood comb, some capped honey at the top, then you have your pollen, kind of in an arc around your brood, and then, your brood in the main portion. So I think it's important to learn sort of what a good pattern is for those of you who are just starting out. I have some examples of a bad pattern here that we can pass around. This is I'm calling the head European bellroot. And so you can look at these after the fact. They have multiple, you have cells that have capped brood in it next to brood of younger ages, because they had many who have died, and they'll pull them out. The queen will go and lay again. So you have brood of all different ages all mixed up together, instead of sort of a consistent, nice pattern throughout, where most of the pupae are the same age. If the queen is an older queen and perhaps she's beginning to fail that spring, it may be that she'll she'll lose her fertility, and she'll end up just being able to lay drones. And so then you'll see what they call like a popcorn kind of pattern here, where we have these drones that are laid in worker cells. Oops, sorry, wrong button. So you have the drones are in a cell that's too small, and so the cappings are all puffed out like that, and you can see they look like they're just bursting and too large for the cell, which in fact they are. And so this is abnormal and not something that it's going nowhere. That hive's not really viable for you. So that's another sign, to work to, as far as evaluating your queen, to watch out for. So if you start also seeing any brood abnormalities, I guess I have a nursing background, and I love epidemiology, so I tend to love to show all these abnormal things. But I think it's important to recognize when you've got abnormal brood, and this is kind of that slumped brood that you will often find in a brood disease. Your larvae should be nice and fat and plump, and in fact, these actually look pretty good. These look actually kind of healthy by comparison to the previous ones, just because these are big, fat, white, plump, and moist, and that's what you want in a larva. And so you can see that this is not viable. This is dead, and the bees will remove it. In fact, around here, all these they've already pulled probably that one out because of the ragged cappings. So the other thing to encourage at this time, when we are having a good honey flow, is to encourage them to build comb. And this is a way of channeling that energy that they ordinarily might try and put towards swarming, to get them to build comb and get some more space for the queen to lay in. So all of those things will reduce their urge to swarm. And what I've been finding is on some of our very dry years, when the bees aren't building as much comb, they'll tend to reuse that comb more often, and you end up with this really dark, old, nasty comb, which does seem to invite brood issues later on. And so Les was my teacher. He used to say, get that old comb out every 3 to 5 years, and now he's down to saying about every 3. So you can hold it up to the light, and if you can see through your comb, usually they say that, then it's still okay to use. But once it gets really, really dark and black, that's the time that you need to start rotating that to the back of the brood nest so that eventually that gets filled with honey and gets harvested, or you can leave it for the winter and then pull it out in the spring. But more and more, the problems that I've been seeing with this type of brood that I have here, this European fowl brood in particular, which has, I think, been causing problems for several years. There had been a bunch of it in California, and it made its way here. And I sent some into Maryland to the testing lab too. So we definitely have it, and it just seems to. Sometimes it responds well to a good nectar flow. It will clear itself up, but in general, these old brood combs seem to really be causing some problems. So, in addition to preventing further disease, it really, you want that nice comb as much as possible when we're on a honey flow, because it naturally triggers the bees' wax glands when we have these big nectar influx periods. So adding empty combs if you have them from the back, and drawn comb if you got it in a Langstroth or course.
What do you mean by drawn comb?
So in a Langstroth hive, they'll have frames with foundation on them. The bees draw out the comb and they build onto that foundation. There's a stamp of the shape of a cell, and we call that drawing out the comb, and they build comb onto that foundation. And so if you have Langstroth hives, you often have some of that already that had been used previously perhaps, or the bees have already built it out. And so if you have some of that extra, if you have members hives and you have extra drawn comb, it's less work for the bees if it's already done. So. And often we'll see in cultivars a lot of tendency toward cross-combing when we have big nectar inflows. And so a lot of times, if you're looking down from above onto, into the hive, down on a bar, and if you start seeing these kind of little puffed out areas, especially at the top, this is the time to correct that. Because the bar, and they often do this on the very last bar, especially at the top, because the brood combs themselves are only ever going to be a finite width, because the brood is only ever going to be a certain length. But the tendency for honey storage areas is that they can make that as long a cell as they want, and they'll often kind of puff it out at the top, which causes problems for the bar next to it, because then that one's going to be skinny on that one side. So if you can get in there with your hive tool, and this area was kind of puffed out, if you just take your hive tool and almost, when these temperatures are warm, it's really easy to do this. You just smooth that puffed out area down. The wax is nice and soft. And the bees, it tends to almost start the capping process for them a little bit, and they'll readily just cap that then at the level that you want it, instead of, they won't build that back out again. So this is the time to do a lot of those corrections, because this is what we want to avoid, and this is what they often will do on the very last bar, because they can. They love to make these really fat combs on the very end. So the way to avoid this is when they start building on that last bar, when they have it in sort of a small shape. If you move that forward in between those last two combs that are fully built out, then they can't really deviate. And so that's the way to control a lot of that building, is to keep moving those bars forward in between comb that's already been built out. But this can be a real issue if you have a big nectar influx and they have nowhere to put it, they'll build really fast, and within a week, it can almost totally get away from you, and it caused a lot of misery in those last bars. Now, if it does happen, it's not the end of the world, because, you know, if they had filled that with honey, and it's so runny at this time of year, and it's not capped and whatnot, then sometimes it's easier to lead it toward the back and just plan to have the bees use that during the winter as forage, as food, and not try and correct it, because a lot of times if that honey's really runny, it's on, you know, if you can't harvest that because it's not ripe yet, or maybe there's brood on one comb and there's honey on another, sometimes it's easier just to keep that toward the back. Keep it out of the comb rotation, however. You know, move it 2 or 3 spots back from your last comb so that building does not happen on the back side of one of these big fat combs, because those are all going to be wrong then. And when they're in that building phase, you'll have all these nice sort of white combs, lovely for cut comb honey later on. But once they've sort of built all the way across onto a bar, you can put several of those together, because ordinarily what I have found is if you give them 2 or a couple of blank bars together, they'll cross those very often and cause issues. Sometimes they'll go, you know, they'll curve it around from one to the other, and so usually to get them to start building, I'll stick them in between combs that are fully built out. But then once they've built pretty much across the top there, you're pretty safe. They really can't deviate too much once they've built all the way across. And so then you can put a couple of these together and give them sort of a little building zone, because, you know, in order to build, they have to cluster together and you know, create a lot of heat for that wax. And so you know, you can give them a little zone where they have several bars that they're working on. Oops, it's not showing. We all know what bearding looks like. So then bearding is when the bees are all hanging out outside. People often mistake that for swarming, you know, initiation. But if swarm season is pretty much past, and you've been in there recently, and you know that there are no queen cells under construction, then you can pretty much safely assume that they're bearding, mostly because of the heat. And we often see this at this time of year when it's hottest in the afternoons. The population is high. They need to get some of those bodies out of there just for better ventilation, but especially when they're trying to ripen off honey, and then just to cool it down. So bearding in itself is okay. What I've read is that when the temperatures get into the 90s, which is pretty common for us, even in San Jose, eventually, that the foraging really decreases. A lot of times the plants are only secreting nectar in the mornings. It's pretty common to begin with, but certainly as it gets hotter, a lot of times there's not much for the bees to do except for gather water in the afternoons, and so you often see them like hanging around, and people are always like, wow, they're just hanging around, what's going on? And a lot of times they're fanning a little bit at the entrance, but bearding is pretty much a part of our summer season. So cooling you can try some measures to try and cool the bees down. You know, shade being one. If you position your colony to begin with under a deciduous tree that's going to have leaves shading in the summer, and we'll lose the leaves in the winter, so it gets the warmth during the winter. Make sure you've got a water source. Ventilation, you know, I don't particularly do much for mine. You know, there's always a lot of discussions about what to do, whether they need other holes drilled in the back, or if you need to pop up one of the bars, or pop up, you know, the lid, you know, and I think that you just have to figure out what maybe works for your situation. Some people do use screen bottoms. I find that when we're not having this type of humid weather, that it's too dry, and that they end up propolising the screen to kind of, you know, protect the brood. I think they can't keep the humidity up in the brood nest with screen bottoms, but a lot of people use them for mite management, and they probably do help somewhat keep the bees cooler in some instances. And of course, a lot of people paint their hives a white color rather than dark, just for those reasons. I used to ring up shade cloth, and I have also put umbrellas out, you know, just hammered in some pipe next to it, you know, where I could stick an umbrella up, you know, from time to time. Now I've got too many, you know, to do all that stuff. I think if you have a small number of colonies, you can rig up a lot of stuff and maybe help them, you know. But, you know, I wouldn't say it's, I can't tell that it makes a huge amount of difference. I think water is the most important thing for them, because they you know, they create a swamp cooler-like effect in the hive, where they have the water in their mouth and they fan the water like a swamp cooler. So, anyway. So the next thing to think about is honey production, which basically is determined by a few things. The size of the colony, and if you split a bunch of colonies, they say that that one full-size colony is going to make more honey than any two smaller, weaker hives would, and so it kind of depends on your strategy. I tend to not make as many splits these days, because there are some years where we really need to be feeding honey. I need extra honey, and so I try and manage as much as possible to get a nice, good-sized colony through that swarm period without dividing. Now, some people seem to, and it takes a little bit of work, and you've got to check the bees, but it's definitely possible, and I think that usually, you know, about 3/4 of my colonies I don't have to split, because I've given them enough room, and I've worked them enough so that once you hit the solstice pretty much, and the day length changes, already you're going to see that the queen is starting to lay less, and a lot of that swarm urge is less, and she's already not laying so much in the back, and so a lot of that gets converted into honey. Now, I don't know, Albuquerque you may have bigger nectar flows, and you may have to manage that. So, and obviously, forage availability and the quality, so many years. We have these really dry periods in July in particular, at least in our area, where things appear to be blooming, but whether there's much nectar being secreted when the plants are stressed, they're not going to be secreting as much nectar, and so these are probably having to work harder, and even though it appears that things are blooming as they would, but we never know how much, what the quality, the actual quantity of nectar is available. So then, of course, if we have these types of rainy days and afternoons, limited foraging, sometimes you'll have the nectar or pollen being washed out by heavy rains and hail and whatnot, and so you're gonna, that's not good for nectar gathering. And high humidity is often a problem for them to ripen the honey. So a lot of times you'll see that you've got a lot of uncapped honey in the hive around monsoon period because they're not able to fan off enough of the liquid. So, and sometimes you'll see that I've had honey ferment that's capped in the comb, and that's kind of unusual. I've also seen it actual bubbling, when it's uncapped in the hive. It's not as common here as it is apparently in the Midwest or in the tropical areas, but I've definitely seen it around. Doesn't pose much of a problem for the bees. They don't seem to care so much, but people don't like it. This is not something that you ordinarily harvest. You could make mead, but so if we're going to be having these more humid days, hopefully, it's going to take them a little bit longer to ripen off that honey. And sometimes you end up with space issues in a full-size hive, in which case, a lot of times I'll have to move the uncapped honey into a smaller colony just so I can continue to have room in the larger colony. A lot of times the small colony is going to need it anyhow down the line. But
so
question?
With fermenting honey, how do you tell? I mean, are you, like if you have
You can see little bubbles in it, and it smells like.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it smells fermented. It's a definite. You can tell immediately when you open it up. Actually. So what they say you can do about that is you can take a capping, a capper, it's comb thing or whatever they call this. They just scratch the cappings off and make the bees reprocess it. But often, and sometimes what you'll see is that later on in the season, as it ferments, underneath that capping, your cappings get all puffed out. I don't have a picture, but they get kind of raised and puffed out. And sometimes if the pressure builds up in there, because it's just like fermenting alcohol, it'll pop the capping up just a little bit, and sometimes you'll have a little kind of thin nectar that kind of runs down. So it's just FYI, because it seems like it comes with more humidity. And this is a good time to process any wax, because we have those really intense hot days when the sun angle is just perfect for solar melters, and so a lot of times, earlier in the spring, you just can't. It just takes a lot longer, and so all this old dark comb, you don't get a whole lot of wax out of it, but this is the thing to do with it is try and move that out of the rotation of the combs and process it. So the way Les always taught us is that around now is you're already starting to think about winter preparations for the bees, because if you don't really have a sense of how much honey is in there for them and their total configuration that they might need for the winter, then you don't know how much excess is available for you as a beekeeper to harvest. And so a lot of times when I do an inspection, a lot of times I will be able to, it kind of depends on what you're looking for, but if you're just kind of checking the amount of food they have, whether the queen is still laying, you can kind of just go in up until you hit eggs, and then well, queen's here, all is well, and most likely they've got a bunch of honey at the back of the brood nest. But every so often I like to go all the way to the front, because on occasion they will have eaten most of the honey right down by the door at the front. And if you have a bunch of honey in the back of the brood nest, this is the time when you can flip some of that, some of those bars to the front, especially if they are capped. That is particularly good because the bees usually will not uncap that and eat it out. But if we have a very dry July, I've seen them eating out honey that I have put toward the front. But at any rate, if you can put a couple of bars of that honey up at the front where you're going to need it for the winter, you're already, then you know from then until about, say, 12, that's sort of like, that's all for the bees. And then anything after, say, 12 is sort of available for harvest. And so a lot of people have questions about knowing how much to take and when. That's sort of a good general. I really can't speak to Langston, but in a top level, that seems to at least give you some feel for making sure that you're not over harvesting for them. And then more and more people have talked about making up summer nukes on a good year. Like Kirk Webster, and there's quite a few people who really feel like if you have a good queen and you want some of that genetics, and in case it's an older queen, you kind of want to make sure, especially if you only have a few colonies, that maybe you have an extra queen. This is the time under good conditions and a good honey flow where if you wanted to make up a nuke and, with the idea that you still would have to pull a lot of bars with that nuke at this time. But a lot of people will overwinter these smaller nukes, and it's a way, it's kind of an insurance with an extra queen there in case, something fails there in the fall. And if you want to make up a nuke and order queens, they're usually readily available. So a lot of people use that as a way to make increases at this time under the best conditions. And around this time, you often see them already in the larger colonies. They're already putting a lot of pollen up at the front. And this, you want to see this because this is, they have to sort of make hay while the sun shines, or whatever. But we often, I think in our area, we don't usually have a pollen dearth here, but I think sometimes we have limited, not a whole lot of, on a dry year, I think that our bees that have overwintering issues, sometimes it has to do with lack of species diversity in their food sources. It's the only thing I can figure out because people feed them sugar water and whatever, and pollen patties. I don't do any of that. I'd rather see, the natural pollen, and hopefully a lot of different ones. And every once in a while we'll have this purple pollen, which there's always a big discussion on what it is. But I think it's always good to see a whole bunch of different colors of pollen because diversity is the key. And as we saw when Wallace Spivak here talking about how pollen really helps their immune system deal with all the insults that are coming their way, that I think pollen is really important, and so we'd like to see that as a part
of winter preparation too. Okay, so, I don't know where I am on the time schedule, but that's about, if anybody wants to look at these, get an example of, what a really bad pattern looks like.
And then there's a cone here that actually has, this was a drum lane clean, and they're drones, like half-size drones in worker cells.